Hi, this is Tim Davis with Do Control, and I want to talk to you today about why identity is so important for SaaS security. And maybe it's not exactly what you might think is the obvious answer here. So let's dig in and talk about this a little bit further. So if we just take a zero trust model, and there's a lot of zero trust models out there, probably as many as there are zero trust vendors, which is basically all of them these days in the security space. So, but let's just pick a model so we have a framework to kind of base our conversation around, right? So let's take this one. If we think about the different aspects, identity, device, network, application workload, and data, right? Seems really applicable to SaaS and SaaS security. So let's take these one by one and look at how they would apply to a particular software as a service application, Microsoft 365, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Google Workspace, Slack, whatever. So let's apply those and think about this. Well, let's leave identity for a moment and let's talk about devices, right? There's all kinds of devices that need access to your SaaS applications that you may not be able to control. They could belong to vendors, they could belong to contractors where you don't manage that device, and giving them managed devices becomes maybe cost prohibitive. Maybe you can do that in some cases with contractors and maybe with some vendors, but doing it universally, it becomes very expensive and very difficult to manage. Then there's, of course, bring your own device. There's pre-employment, post-employment. A lot of times people before they start, after they start, or after they've completed tenure at an organization will still need access to different SaaS applications, particularly HR systems like Workday or some of the other HR applications that are out there. So we can't really count on device as being a limiting factor or a controlling factor in our SaaS protection model when we look to apply zero trust. What about the network? Well, of course not the network, right? We can try to force everybody through an SSE cloud, but that limits the productivity of SaaS applications. And again, it might work for some internal only applications, in which case I would almost argue you're really doing zero trust network access. You're not really doing SSE at that point. But that's maybe a little bit of just a semantic discussion. But by definition, SaaS applications are typically accessible over the internet. And that productivity, that collaboration is a big value add for SaaS. Otherwise, I'm just essentially running something in Microsoft's cloud or Salesforce's cloud. But if I don't have that collaboration capability, whether that's user to SaaS or SaaS to SaaS, then I'm really losing something along the way and diminishing the value. So again, network, maybe not a control that we can use. What about application or workload, right? So maybe in the intra-app scenario, this is going to be a challenge because there's so much of the 1 + 1 = 3 SaaS to SaaS applications that are more and more prevalent out there. There's ecosystems around all these different big tent SaaS applications now. Think about Salesforce. How useful is Salesforce if you don't have it integrated with a tool like HubSpot or Outreach for your top of funnel sales activities? Same thing, if you don't have it integrated with Clary, right? Now you're limited, or you don't get the benefits of using a tool like Clary to manage forecasting. And there's dozens, maybe even hundreds, I guess, of other tools out there that are just built around Salesforce. So the application and workload capability to limit here is also very limited. And then the data, right? When we think about the data, we've got a lot of challenges here because that's fundamentally what you own in the SaaS app, right? You don't own the source code, you don't own the infrastructure. All that you own, if you want to think about even being able to own it, is in a tool like Google Workspace or Slack is your data. That's the piece you own, but that's the bad news. The good news is that's the piece you care about, right? That's the piece you care about protecting. That's what's yours to protect in that SaaS shared responsibility model. You're not worried about protecting Slack or Oracle, or their Microsoft, whomever. You're not worried about protecting their infrastructure and protecting their code. That's their job. You're worried about protecting your data. That's your job in that shared responsibility model. So the tool you really have to use here is identity. So let's think about though why that it seems obvious. And why that control can be very limited and difficult to manage, right? So if we just think about SaaS in these three frameworks, right? We've got data, we've got permissions, and we've got integrations, right? So data protection has traditionally flowed around CASB and DLP. And then permissions around, access reviews and around, things like emerging markets like SSPM, right? So, and then integrations, right? We talked about that earlier, about those whole ecosystems that are out there, as well as API integrations that let SaaS talk to, other tools, on-prem things, all of that integration piece that goes together, right? But again, none of these things really lend themselves very well to identity, because who or what did this thing, right? How do we know who the actor was or what the actor was in a particular action? And then how did they interact with it, right? Did they come in the front door through a sign-on? Did they access data because it was shared with them in a collaboration way? Or worse, maybe it was accidentally shared in a public way? And then, from an API perspective, who authorized that API? What permissions did they have? And then there's the challenge of the inventory, right? Like, how do I know the current state, which is constantly changing, of course, of the assets that are inside in my SaaS application, right? So again, doesn't lend itself well to inventory. And the same thing for configurations in SaaS applications. We've already talked about how the integrations, don't lend themselves very well to an identity either. And then, here's the other thing to think about, right? I mentioned that you have this concept of inventory in SaaS. The what do I have here? What's going on? And that's constantly changing. And what's constantly driving that change is events, users doing things in SaaS. You want your users doing things in SaaS. They're called productivity tools for a reason. You want your users, you want your employees at your organization to be productive, to be creating content, to be sharing content, to be collaborating with people inside the organization, people outside the organization. You want that to happen because it's going to make you more competitive, make you a better company, a better organization. But understanding that from a security perspective gets very challenging when I've got a whole bunch of people with access to a file. Now, who's doing what? How do I manage that? How do I understand who should and who should not have access to a file in Google Workspace or in Teams, Microsoft Teams or SharePoint? Right? Those are the challenges that really make using identity as our single control very, very difficult to do. Now, the problem, of course, is that we talked about earlier, that's the only control that we really have. So how do we adapt? How do we really take this model and really begin to understand how we can apply it to SaaS platforms? Well, we've tried a lot of other things, right? We've tried taking Secure Web Gateway and enforcing it as a SaaS security model, and we've tried, of course, CASB's been around for almost 10 years now, or maybe a little over 10 years. But let's talk about maybe why those solutions don't work so well. If we think about proxy-based SASE or SSE, whichever acronym you like to use for that, right? This is really just, in most cases, taking Secure Web Gateway technology that's made when I'm going to an untrusted site and using that proxy, that full SSL decrypt, the quote-unquote good man in the middle approach to securing my SaaS application and the data that resides in there. And that works. That's the forward proxy use case, right? The first one that's shown here. And that works really well if all I care about is controlling uploads and downloads and access, like user access. Where that really falls apart, though, is when I start to do things like collaborations, right? Because that actually happens from the SaaS to a third party, and my proxy doesn't necessarily see that. Same challenge that I have with when I move away from browser-based and start using things like thick clients. A lot of people use thick clients for applications like Slack and Teams, and it can be very challenging for the tools, those tools to be able to intercept and decrypt that traffic effectively. There's challenges like certificate pinning that make SSL decryption not work, right? Now I don't trust, as probably I shouldn't, I don't trust that man in the middle anymore, and I can't be fooled into trusting that man in the middle so that we can do that decryption. There's also just some really operationally basic challenges, like large files. If you think about a SaaS application as a productivity tool, many times the SaaS vendors themselves, because they're focused on productivity, they're focused on user experience, that's what they really want to drive, that's what they really want to happen for them as customers. So they don't want something in the path, something in the middle. And so they're very resistant to solutions like browser isolation and extension. They're really resistant to reverse proxy, and they're resistant even to forward proxy. And by the way, let's talk about those other two use cases, right? Browser isolation, browser isolation tends to be very expensive, and deploying it in any kind of scale for SaaS is typically just cost prohibitive. Browser extensions, a little less cost prohibitive, still pretty difficult to manage, doesn't really do a whole lot for you from a SaaS security perspective, other than maybe helping you out with shadow apps, tenancy control, things like that. And then there's reverse proxy. Reverse proxy is super challenging to implement successfully, precisely because these modern web applications are so complex. If all Microsoft or Salesforce was doing was serving you static content, good old HTTP pages or things like that, then reverse proxy would be a fantastic solution for a lot of these SaaS security challenges, particularly when we're talking about unmanaged devices. But it's not, right? Think about how complex and how much code is running in a Salesforce Lightning page, or in something in Google Workspace, right, where you're creating a presentation and slides, or you're using Teams to send messages and attach files, in a one-to-many asynchronous collaboration. Like, those are all very complex things that are happening. They just happen to be happening inside a browser, but it's not HTML. And so rewriting all of that to URL, to user reverse proxy, rewriting all those URLs, rewriting all that code becomes very, very, very difficult to do. And again, it just doesn't scale, right? So there's lots of problems that the proxy-based approach doesn't work for. So what happens, right? The proxy gets combined with traditional API CASB. This is the 10-year-old technology. And this is roughly how this works. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but go with me, right? So the CASB asks the SaaS application, have you had any changes? The SaaS application says, yes, of course I have, right? People are using me all the time. All this stuff has changed. And then the CASB says, okay, send me all the changes. The SaaS application starts sending the changes. He starts asking for them one at a time. At some point, he's going to hit the speed limit. He's going to get told by the SaaS application, you got to quit asking me for stuff. Like, it's the go away, you're bothering me scenario, right? Because why? SaaS applications are not security tools, they're productivity tools. And so they're going to limit security tools from what they can ask from them, so that they can ensure that they have the resources to respond to their users and use and keep the people who are using it productive, and give them a good user experience. Again, experience over, and that's not a knock on the SaaS vendors, right? That's their business, that's their model, that's what their tool is built for, right? And they didn't think about, or maybe didn't prioritize as much security going into the game. But that's not what they were trying to build, right? So we're kind of trying to put security on the top of these things after the fact. And again, there's just in this traditional API CASB model, it just doesn't work. I've seen it take days for CASBs to complete these scans, sometimes even weeks in some really, really extreme cases, right? So that's all that time your data is exposed. And oh, by the way, this is all predicated and focused around doing traditional DLP. But that kind of even itself lends itself to the really old school model of thinking that, well, my sensitive data is on-prem or on managed endpoints, and my not so sensitive, don't really care about it data, that's what's in the cloud, right? That is pre-2018 thinking, right? Now your sensitive data is in the cloud, right? Just accept it, it is. All right, so it's in your SaaS applications, it's in your infrastructure as a service solutions, right? Your sensitive data is in the cloud. Many organizations don't even have on-prem anymore. But for most organizations, they've got some, probably way more than they realize, sensitive data that's sitting around in these cloud applications. And so this approach that was checking to see, is this data sensitive before we do anything about it, is not really a meaningful approach. Yes, the data is sensitive. Like, let's just assume that it is, and let's ask a better question. Who should have access to this data? And what we found is that there's a great way to answer this question, right? So, and it has to do with applying identity in a little bit different way. When you want to apply identity in SaaS, you really have to understand what SaaS is trying to do, right? Again, SaaS is not a security tool. It's a productivity tool. It's a data storage tool. And so that means we had to understand the data model. It means we need to understand the types of activities that are going to happen in that SaaS application. And then let's ask ourselves, what are some meaningful controls that are available to us to leverage identity to then be able to protect the information that sits in our SaaS applications and in those tenants, right? So let's break those three things down. The data model. We need to understand how the data is stored. Is this structured data like a ServiceNow, unstructured file sharing apps, right? Your Microsoft OneDrive, SharePoint, Teams, your Google Workspace, your Box, your Dropbox, all of the half dozen others that are out there as well. They basically just store files. Or is it something a little bit of both? Salesforce is an excellent example of that. Are these code repos, right? Again, all these are going to have very different data models. Even some of the apps that are unstructured data. Box has a very different data model than Microsoft, than Google, right? They take very different approaches, even solving the exact same problems. Not uncommon, but it can be challenging if you're trying to apply a monolithic model or a monolithic approach to securing across all those different applications, right? So you've got to think about the model, not only how the data is stored within that SaaS platform, but how the data can be accessed, right? So is it all through, what I call the front door, right? User has to go to the site, sign in, go through their, hopefully multi-factor authentication. If not, if you don't have multi-factor authentication on your SaaS, please do that now. Pause the video, go fix that, then come back and listen to the rest. But are there other ways that it can be accessed? We talked about SaaS to SaaS connectivity, sharing by user, sharing by system. What do I mean by sharing by system? Well, here's the interesting thing that can happen when you integrate a tool like Slack with a tool like Google, right? When you put a file in a Google channel that's public, now Google wants to, or Slack wants to go and grant that public permission to that file in Google. Now there are things you can do to tone that down. There are settings you can put in place, but again, security settings often come at the cost of productivity and ease of use. SaaS vendors are almost always going to choose ease of use and productivity over security, right? So these are not the default settings. Important to know, important to understand, important to realize that when you start using multiple SaaS applications together in an integrated way, Slack, Zoom, Google, right? Even the Microsoft suites, even the interactions between the different tools in Microsoft, you can have lots of unintended consequences. I'll give you another example. What happens when you invite somebody from outside of your organization to join your team in Microsoft Teams? Well, by default, unless you've configured things otherwise explicitly, what happens is when that external user joins that team, he or she now has access to all the files that are associated with that team and that team's SharePoint site. Is that really what you want? Is that okay? Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But did you even know that that was happening, right? And again, Microsoft's not going to flag that for you and tell you, right? Because again, productivity. They want things to be easy. They want things to be collaborative. But we have to probably pump the brakes a little bit here and say, hey, let's understand your data model so that we can actually do some effective security here based on the identity, not only of who's in those teams, but now who we're adding, and then understanding what type of data they're going to have access to, right? And then we have to understand the activity, right? In SaaS, there's all kinds of different activities that go on. It's not just uploads and downloads. If it was just uploads and downloads, then a proxy model would work great for us. But it's not. It's so much more than that, right? There's all the different collaboration options, right? Of explicit sharing, general sharing, public sharing, sharing by domain, right? There's all those different things I can do just in file sharing SaaS apps. And again, all the different ones, Box, Google, Microsoft, Dropbox, they all implement those things in slightly different ways. Sometimes the concepts align, and sometimes they don't, but they all implement them in very different ways. So you have to look at what's going on and what the current context is to understand the risk. What do I mean by the context? All right, let's say user in finance shares a file from SharePoint. Is that good? Is that bad? Is that risky? Is it dangerous? Is it fine? Well, I don't think you could possibly know based on just the information that I gave you about a user who happens to work in finance, shares a file from SharePoint. Who did they share it with? Did they share it with their auditor, with their accountant, the external accountant that's been a business partner? Did they share it internally? I didn't even specify they shared it externally. I just kind of assumed that. Did they share it externally? But when they shared it externally, was it publicly? Was it with a trusted business partner? So who did they share it with? Furthermore, the context of this person, right? And this gets us back to that concept of identity. What do we know about this person who shared the file? Are they getting ready to walk out the door? Are they turning their notice? They're getting ready to leave and go to a competitor? Very different set of risk than if they're not, right? So knowing things about the user, and the event, and what the user's action means, becomes very important as well. Some of that lends itself to data model, but more of that lends itself to activity or events and the context around them. So really understanding what a user is doing in SaaS and how much risk might that be creating for my organization. So we talked about these problems and then how do we think about these. So what can you do about it? What we found is that almost 9 out of 10 SaaS sharing risk can be completely automated, right? So it's actually not as bad of a problem as maybe you thought when I was first talking about it, right? You don't have to be precognizant like the picture here from the movie Minority Report. You don't have to know ahead of time what people are going to do necessarily. As long as you have the context, you can take the context and you can take the event, the action that they take, and then you can automate a lot of your response to know very quickly without having to do full DLP scans to allow to manage the risk effectively, right? And again, if you can automate, if you're talking about 1,000 events and I can automate 900 of them, that's a win, right? Because I'm getting way more protection than I was before, and then I get visibility to the other 10% that now I can have somebody look at and apply understanding. And by the way, this becomes an iterative model where I can then apply more automation and understanding once I get things tighter and tighter. Last thing I want to mention here is this idea of permissive versus restrictive models. I talk to people all the time that fall in both categories. Talk to people who have organizations who have their SaaS applications locked down so tight. There's no collaboration. There's no sharing. They're essentially, it's just file sharing in Microsoft's cloud or file sharing in Google's cloud, or but there's none of that benefit of external collaboration. Sometimes there's not even benefit of internal collaboration between groups or organizational units within that broader company or team. So it can be very challenging for those people. But the thing I hear consistently from them is that they're looking for ways to lighten things up a little bit while still managing their risk, right? And it's going to be around identity and around the kind of controls I talked about. But this also works for the other side of the equation too, right? Or not the equation, but the other extreme of organizations who were maybe born in the cloud, born in SaaS only, SaaS first. I talk to people at organizations all the time that have absolutely no internal IT infrastructure at all. Everything is SaaS for them, right? Or it's in a public cloud technology, right? So they don't have that legacy of those internal apps, but because they were born in the cloud, they didn't have native security kind of built in to start, right? Because again, SaaS is all about productivity and collaboration, not necessarily about security. And so they now are realizing that, hey, we've got users, it's kind of the wild, wild west out here, and we've got users doing all kinds of things. We don't have visibility, we don't have controls over them, right? So the kinds of controls I'm talking about can be applied gradually in both scenarios. The lockdown to loosening things up a little bit and letting people be more productive and use those productivity tools in proper and business appropriate ways and letting those users be happier, right? And kind of moving from the shutdown completely to the middle, but it can also be used on the other extreme where people is wide open, and I want to kind of gradually move things to a little more restricted model, not about slowing down the business or making people less productive, but diminishing and managing the risk that some of those behaviors of the Wild Wild West maybe have created for your organization. So hopefully you learned a little bit of something about thinking differently about how we do SaaS security and how we should be doing SaaS security going forward. You can reach us at Do Control here, and we can be happy to tell you more about how we're solving some of these specific problems. Thanks so much for giving me a little bit of your time today. Hope you have a great rest of your week.